The title of my presentation today is Intersectional Assemblages, Dilemmas and Betrayals, Trials and Tribulations of Queer-feminist post/decolonial ethics and solidarity. But I think this paper looks at the heart of what a feminist community of practice, including this conference, which is a prime example of a fascinating and working feminist community of practice, and thank you for the organizers for that. These challenges these communities faces. And I think we had examples in discussions, in interactions, in miscommunications, where we weren't always as successful as feminist community of practice to be both intellectually challenging and challenge inequalities, but also keeping open the dialogue so that feminists of all types, third, second, fourth, and so on, and allies have the opportunity to learn from each other and to find commonalities and work together. So, what I want to do is look at the problem that arise from divide within feminisms. And you will be well aware of it, but just a short recapitulation of where we are. In the second half of the 20th century in the global north, so-called second wave feminism set out to dismantle all-pervading patriarchy, in particular the patriarchal oppression of women and the social construction of women. Think of Beauvoir's famous aphorism of 1949, a woman is not born but made. And this this construction of a woman, of women in aid of male hegemony. Following on now, third wave feminisms broadened the emancipatory impulses. Liberation from oppression included the deconstruction of gender, and we find in the academia here the move from women's studies to gender studies, and now also to trans studies, to queer studies, or in case of my institute, to intersectional social justice studies. Yeah? So there's a movement here. And third wave feminism also paid closer attention to different areas of privilege, such as socioeconomic power and whiteness. And during this process of widening and complicating the emancipatory struggle, frankly, a rift appeared. While rifts in feminist stances in the 1980s and second wave feminism centered around sex-positive versus anti-pornography feminists, from the 1990s onwards, the most pronounced rift in feminist communities of practice focused on what could be called the loss of the woman in feminism. Some radical feminists pronounced their discomfort with gender studies, transgender liberation, and intersectional solidarity, identifying these themes as either distractions or even as harmful Trojan horses of patriarchy. Indeed, the fight against patriarchy, they claimed and still claim, has been forgotten in third and fourth wave feminism. Yet in the fight against patriarchy, hetero or cis patriarchy, contemporary queer feminist resistance, solidarity and ethics necessarily address sexual and gender identity justice intersectionally in their complex interpellation with a messy wealth of identitarian markers and constructs inscribed onto our individual bodies by, among others, reproductive-patriarchal, colonial and neo-colonial, racist, nationalist, classist, ageist, able-ist, and other socio-corporeal normative discourses. In contrast, some second-wave radical feminists need to answer the question if their continuing binary construction of gender in criticism of queer theory, their trans exclusivity in opposition to trans solidarity, and their lack of reflection on their global northern and white privilege is not the real Trojan horse in the fight against sexism and patriarchy. For instance, my own theoretical work around transphobia, there I have investigated the inseparability of sexism, homo-bi, and transphobia in what I've coined aphalophobia, a Lacanian, a nod to Lacan, the fear of the instability of gender binary power privileges, or the fear of losing straight, cis, male hegemony as systemic power broker of hetero and cis patriarchy. As you all know, patriarchy works in two very, very simple steps. Patriarchy is so easy to explain, yeah, because it has just two steps, yeah, very easy. So what are they? So first of all, you have to reduce the wealth of the human gender lexicon into just two poles, male and female. So from the wealth of richness of the gender lexicon that we have as humans, we only keep two sides. Male and female. And then, in the second step, we have to claim that one of them is better than the other. That's it. And that's the male. Now, any feminism that only opposes the second step is intrinsically weakened from the outset and adds credulity to the more fundamental premise one, which reduces the gender lexicon into male and female, and by doing so aids patriarchy in the process. Yet, it is not only the inclusion of gender diversities that riles die-hard second-wavers. The fundamental binary view on gender comes with dogmatic positions which have successfully filtered into policies and laws. We have the funny situation that currently in the global north and in transnational NGOization of women empowerment, we have second wave ideologies becoming policies, while we are in the advocacy and activist stance firmly rooted in third and fourth wave feminism. So there is a huge mismatch. This has led to the rise of what has been called carceral feminism by Elizabeth Bernstein, by the unholy alliance between religious fundamentalists and feminists in the form of neo-abolitionism, in forms of sex trafficking, by the feminists' fabrications of neo-Puritan moral panics around sex, and by what has been analyzed as systemic feminist violence. These are not imaginaries. These are real problems, and we should not think they are not real just because alt-right and free speech enablers of hate speech use them to target any enforcements of counter-patriarchal measures. There are indeed feminist-derived forms of thought policing, empty virtue signaling, reductionist moralizing, and yes, oppression and systemic violence. Harmful dogmatic positions include the myth of the perpetual victimhood of women in the biopolitical and biolegal system, which renders invisible and even ridicules non-cis female victims, for instance, of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Other dogmata include feminist secularism, what I've called in a recent article homosecularism, and the harmfulness of religion per se, or the evil of sex work, which is called prostitution in these second wave contexts, and the evil of what is called pornography, what we should probably call sexual cinema, and the necessary oppressiveness of cultural and religious practices such as veiling, arranged marriage, and dowry. Against such dogmatic fundamentalisms, third-wave feminists have successfully employed, among others, the concepts of agency and privilege in order to complicate and disrupt the reductionist views on gender and power relations, in particular in intersectional contexts as pointed out above. In response, second wavers regularly bemoan the lack of solidarity with the patriarchally oppressed women by those queer feminists who call, for instance, on the one hand, for a boycott of Israel, but remain silent about female genital cutting and enforced full-body veils. So that is the argument of second wavers, right? So, and that is, I want to illustrate that problem and a recent controversy in the German-speaking feminist scene. And this is a discussion around a queer critical anthology called Bite Reflexes, which was published in Berlin earlier this year. And it was taken up by notorious second waver Alice Schwarzer in the July issue of her feminist magazine Emma. Here, second wavers and neo-second wavers launch a frontal assault on gender studies, on queer theory, and on any form of diversity-oriented or intersectional feminism. Now, Judith Butler and leading intersectional feminist, German feminist Sabine Haag responded to what they said was defamation in an article in the German weekly Die Zeit in August, which was then rejoined by a reply by Alice Schwarzer, which was equally provocatively titled Character Assassination, Rufmord. A close reading of the debate in the German feminist circle yields a maybe understandable yet still unnerving privileging of polemics, hostility, reductionism, and unwillingness to listen closely on both sides. Academically, non-diversity, women-only oriented feminism may be obsolete, but does this mean that those feminists whose thinking does not appear to have evolved much from second-wave radicalism do not have any valid points at all in their defensive critiques and invectives against what they see as the usurpation of women's liberation by non-cisgender women and cultural relativists and enablers of what they see as harmful practices that are, as they say, justified as long as they are culturally or religiously underpinned. So what is the state in the face of this, the state of global women's solidarity? Now, as Spivak has shown in her advocacy for strategic essentialism, there is indeed a risk. Maybe it's also a generational thing that we can discuss. There is a risk of what she calls cheap urban radicalism. Cheap urban radicalism espoused by the privileged queer subject, sometimes you could say queer-normative theorist, who claims to speak for the global south while enjoying augmented privileges in the global north. So a lot of tenured professors in America who claim some ancestry in the global south, have a huge salary there, and then speak for the global south from the safety of their tenure at a US university. So these who, in Nikita Dhawan's word, who can afford to reject pragmatic politics in favor of more radical interventions. All a question of who can actually afford to be that radical and say we don't need pragmatism or strategic essentialism. So, is queer feminist nihilism in danger to create ideological self-sabotage and betray solidarity, as Alice Schwarzer would claim? As much as it is reductionist and wrong to state that all women in, say, Iran maybe, are oppressed by religion, it is also equally wrong to call for the support of violent and oppressively hetero and cis patriarchal groups such as Hamas, as done, as Alice Schwarzer says, by Judith Butler. And the reasons We cannot simply support one violent patriarchal group because it opposes another form of oppression, and that kind, Zionism, is that life is far too complicated. You cannot simply think, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It is more complicated than that. While agency is an important benchmark for negotiating societal scripts and cultural practice, agency is also always contextual and relative and can include self-delusion in face of powerlessness or complicity with oppression. Both dogmata of the good victim, Hamas must be good since it is on the other side of the victims, on the side of the victims of Zionism, and the dogma of post-colonial agency as an absolute, aid only reductionist and black and white discourses on both sides. The idea that the oppressed are always morally superior and one-dimensionally good, as well as the idea that those with historical and racial privilege need to abstain from interfering or even voicing opinions in many cases, simply supports concrete experiences of harm, suffering, and oppression. Nikita Dhawan has demonstrated in her pertinent critique of Jasper Puar and Joseph Massad how state phobia sabotages emancipation. By conflation of any reproductive heteronorm with the result of colonialism, Puar and Massad, as privileged urban radicals in their rightful activist cause against, for instance, pinkwashing and homonationalism, appear, unfortunately, themselves complicit with forms of state oppression. These blind allies and this, what you could call hypocrisy in parts of the queer post-colonial discourse, needs to be addressed within queer feminist circles so that the progressive left not be naively instrumentalized by harmful agendas, and scholars and activists from the global north be rendered voiceless in the face of any suffering which is culturally and post-colonially framed. In other words, unable to exercise any form of solidarity. The politics of voice become obvious when the post-colonial subjects who argue against cultural practices and declare themselves emancipated from, for instance, the veil, female genital cutting, are then sidelined and vilified. And we have that in the famous case of global southern feminists who are very, very clearly speaking out against such cultural practices and who are then be criticized by radical third-wave intersectionalists, although who are not from these regions. And they are then vilified, for instance, as Islamophobes or racists, and not being taken seriously in the same way as those who argue for the suspense of an ethical universalia and pragmatic benchmarks on the grounds of culture. Here, Judith Butler and others, as Schwarzer rightly criticized, have gone too far and have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. If we would apply this logic of cultural argumentation to 1950s global northern religious and cultural landscapes, we simply would not have in the global north reproductive rights. And we would not have feminism that is counter-religious. We would have not in Christianity or some form of Christianity's woman emancipation and Anglican women priests. We simply would not have that. And rampant clerical sexual abuse in the global north would still be even more sacro-patriarchally facilitated and protected. I have some more which I need to skip over the whole question of religion and complicity. But I want to finish with this provoking, in this provoking lecture, with all the queering, troubling, and subverting. It might be worth to ask the question: what is then the possibility of a queer or post-queer ethics, or ethics of solidarity after queering and subverting. And I propose the reorientation and queer feminist ethics, which is mindful of white privilege, yet still active and proactive in alliances against social injustice, based not on a simple monolithic understanding of agency, but on an understanding of agency that is empowered and informed, focusing on concrete embodied suffering as pragmatic linchpin for activist solidarity. Thank you very much.